In the heart of medieval Europe, beneath the echo of cathedral bells and the rustle of velvet gowns, there existed a terror so quiet, so invisible, it left no footprints in the snow. It moved without sound, struck without warning, and disappeared, like mist at dawn. It was not war, it was not plague, it was the shadow of an assassin. Imagine, if you will, Florence in the year 1273. The city is alive, sunlight glinting off stained glass windows, merchants calling out prices in the crowded market square, the air rich with the scent of lavender and iron. But inside the stone halls of the noble families, a different reality unfolds. Every whispered conversation could be a confession. Every passing glance might hold a threat, because somewhere in the crowd, unseen and patient, walks someone who's been paid not to talk, but to end a life. There was a name that no one dared to speak aloud, a guild known only through rumors and burial records. La Cittadella, not the sect of the night. Their members wore no insignias, they took no credit. They left behind no trace, except silence and cold skin. No trial, no witnesses, just the quiet rearranging of power in the morning. And at the center of one of their most whispered legends was a woman named Lady Isadora of Florence. To the world, she was a vision, beauty, grace, influence. She hosted poets and princes in her marble villa. Her parties were lit by candlelight and lined with gold-trimmed tapestries. But beneath her silks, she carried fear like a hidden dagger. Her only son, heir to the powerful Della Torre estate, had become the target of a ruthless faction determined to seize their land. Florence, though glorious, was a battlefield disguised as a city, and power was not inherited. It was defended so. In the shadows of Santa Croce Basilica, behind a confession booth that no longer held a priest, Lady Isadora met a man. His name was Caldus. No last name, no origin, just a face that never blinked, and a voice as soft as snowfall. For a price, Caldus made a man disappear. That man had sworn vengeance against Isadora's son. He never got the chance to fulfill it. Some say he was found face down in the Arno River. Others say he was never found at all. But from that moment on, Florence changed. Nobles began to hire food tasters again. Servants were questioned more aggressively. Locks were replaced with metal imported from Venice. Some families refused to hold banquets after dark, because once you accept that a killer can walk among you unnoticed, trust itself becomes a foreign language. This was no longer just politics, it was survival, and artists, always the mirror of society's heartbeat, began to respond. But they didn't draw blood. They painted shadows. In frescoes, hooded figures began appearing tucked behind pillars, lurking in the backgrounds of religious scenes. In sculpture, angels looked a little more alert, a little more mortal. A hand might grip something under a robe. Eyes carved into stone no longer looked heavenward, but sideways, into the dark. People didn't speak about assassins in the open, but they began to see them everywhere. The stories traveled faster than the blades. A servant hears something at midnight. A monk sees a figure vanish into a monastery wall. A child draws a cloaked man in the corner of a prayer book, and no one knows where he learned it. The fear was not just of dying, it was of not knowing who pulled the string. There is something almost holy about fear when it's silent. It reshapes us, makes us alert. It seeps into the folds of fabric, into the corners of halls, into art, into history. Historians later uncovered strange marks etched into marble columns across Italy and France, symbols believed to be warnings, coded signs that an assassin had been there or might return. These weren't left as threats, they were records, ghostly fingerprints left for those who knew how to read them. Florence was not the only place. In Paris, under the vaulted ceilings of Saint-Chapelle, nobles began altering their architecture. Secret corridors, trapdoors, mirrors placed in odd corners to reflect entryways. The age of grandeur had shifted to an age of caution. Lady Isadora was never accused, never touched. She lived to see her son inherit everything. She died peacefully, surrounded by family, but those close to her whispered that she prayed every night, not for forgiveness, but for the strength to keep doing what she believed was right. And that is the mystery of the assassin's shadow. It is not just death, it is the question it leaves behind. Was it justice, or just fear made flesh? This is only the beginning of our journey. If you want to keep exploring this hidden world of art, of secrets, of silent powers, subscribe to the channel and help us bring more forgotten stories to light. Your support gives us the strength to keep digging, and to bring calm, compelling history to your nights. Now, let's play a little game of observation. Here's a question for you. Which symbol was often hidden in medieval art to signal the presence of an assassin? A cloaked figure with a gloved hand, be a dove holding a scroll. Comment your answer below with A or B, and let us know what you think the artist was really trying to say. Let's uncover the whispers together. The brush of a medieval artist was never just a tool, it was a blade, a whisper, a shield. And in a time when fear moved through the marble halls of cities like Florence and Paris, when assassins like Caldus walked unnoticed beneath cathedral arches, artists began to speak, not with voices, but with symbols. It began subtly. At first, a figure in the corner of a painting wore a cloak drawn a little too tightly, his face hidden in unnatural shadow. Then came the repetition, gloved hands, grasping goblets, daggers, half concealed by folds of velvet, hooded silhouettes that shouldn't belong in scenes of feasts or worship. To the untrained eye, it was decoration, but to those who lived in furor, in guilt, it was a message, a mirror. One of the most prolific voices in this silent language was Matteo di Serro, a painter from Siena, whose works once adorned the halls of noble families across Italy. Matteo was not a man of wealth or noble blood. He was a witness. He had painted for Lady Isadora herself, and in the corner of one of his lesser-known pieces, tucked beneath the hem of a saint's robe, is a faint outline of a snake coiled around, a laurelus symbol scholars now believe was Matteo's quiet protest, a warning that the scene's holiness had been compromised by murder. Corbin of Rouen, a stained glass master, pushed this further. In the Basilica of St. Denis, he created an elaborate window depicting the parable of the Good Samaritan. But in one panel, just above the shoulder of the wounded man, stands a monk with a dagger barely visible at his hip. His face is turned, his hands clasped, as if in prayer, but the blade, glittering with a touch of gold, tells a second story. It was Corbin's genius to blend truth and illusion so seamlessly that even clergy who commissioned his work never noticed what he had hidden in plain sight. Symbols emerged not just in people, but in objects. The poisoned apple, so often associated with temptation, began appearing in secular tapestries and devotional manuscripts. In one anonymous French codex, a young noblewoman receives an apple during confession, a subtle nod to both sin and sabotage. Ivy, which once stood for eternal life, took on a darker meaning when it wrapped around weapons or crossed thresholds. It became a symbol of entrapment, beauty that strangles. Nature used to conceal danger. And then there were the faces, painted eyes that did not look at the divine, but sideways at the viewer, statues with lips parted, not in praise, but as if about to speak. These were not accidents. Artists understood that they could not say aloud what they suspected or feared, but they could invite us to look closer. They could embed in a single brushstroke 1,000 secrets, and trust that one day, someone would be watching closely enough to see them. One of the most chilling examples survives in a carved wooden panel from a private chapel in southern France. It appears, at first, to depict the Virgin Mary shielding a lamb from wolves. But look again. The wolves are not wolves, they are men, cloaked and thin, their hands too human. And one of them wears a signet ring that, centuries later, was traced to a known patron of La Seta della Notte. The lamb, pure and fragile, is cradled not in mercy, but in preparation for sacrifice. What does this tell us? That artists were not just chroniclers of their time, they were conspirators, protectors, mourners. They knew that speaking the truth was dangerous, so they layered their messages beneath beauty. They disguised courage as craft. There is a kind of heartbreak in this, a quiet sorrow, because these messages were not always seen in their time. Some were erased, others misunderstood, but some endured, waiting centuries for curious eyes, for hearts ready to listen not just to color and form, but to silence. We, the viewers of the present, become part of this delicate communication. We are the ones Matteo and Corbin painted, for across generations. We are the inheritors of these whispers, and so the next time you stand before a medieval painting, don't just admire the colors. Ask, why is that figure turned away? What does that fruit symbolize? Why is there a blade where it does not belong? Because in a world where death moved without sound, artists chose to speak with shadows, and the shadows they never forget. Stone has a memory. It listens. It holds the weight of prayers, footsteps, and secrets. And in medieval Europe, when art was inseparable from faith and survival, even the cold, unyielding surfaces of cathedrals and castles were not immune to fear. They bore silent witness to a world where assassins like Caldus moved through the same corridors as priests, where danger was hidden not in the blade but in the eyes that never looked away. Take the Cathedral of Toledo, a marvel of Gothic ambition. Its arches soar heavenward, its altars are drenched in gold, and yet, tucked behind a row of gilded saints, there is a mural that tells a story most never notice. It depicts a Holy Communion, a scene of grace and unity, but the detail that haunts those who study it is almost imperceptible. A single chalice, shaded darker than the rest, its rim inscribed with a barely visible skull. For centuries, it was dismissed as a stylistic flourish. But recent restoration revealed something startling. Beneath the paint, an earlier layer depicted a hand tipping a fine powder into the cup, a forgotten confession, a silent warning buried beneath divine illusion. The story behind that mural is whispered by archivists and historians. A plot to poison the Bishop of Zamora, orchestrated by political rivals, was only prevented when a young nun, a woman who claimed to receive visions, insisted on tasting the wine first. Her collapse before the altar was the only reason the bishop lived. She died hours later. The mural, painted shortly after, is now seen as a monument to her sacrifice. But it is also a map of truth, deliberately hidden and rediscovered only when someone dared to ask why. A sacred image felt wrong. Artists were not the only ones embedding messages. Sculptors carved their anxieties and knowledge into figures that lined church doorways and tombs. A knight, his hand resting over his heart, might seem like a symbol of chivalry, but look behind his back, and his other hand grasps a concealed blade. Saints are rendered with eyes slightly narrowed, their stances rigid, not serene, but alert. Protection, perhaps, not from evil as a concept, but from a very real threat. Brother Elian, a Benedictine monk known now only through his translated journals, spent his life wandering from abbey to cathedral, studying these subtle cues. He believed that true faith did not blind itself to danger, but acknowledged it with reverence. Elian recorded how the play of sunlight through stained glass changed the meaning of sculptures over the course of a day. Morning light would cast halos, but at dusk, shadows deepened expressions and shifted the direction of every painted gaze. The sacred became suspicious. The holy became human. Elian wrote often of how silence could speak, how a statue's bent head might represent submission or fear, how the angle of a chalice or the placement of a single rose in a fresco could expose alliances or betrayals. He believed the artists of his time were not just painters, but historians working in code. The church may have commissioned the work, but the soul behind the brush belonged to someone who had lived the terror of not knowing whom to trust. And perhaps, most haunting of all, is the role of scent. Something forgotten in most studies of medieval art. Pigments were often mixed with natural oils, myrrh, cedarwood, frankincense. But there are cases, rare and mysterious, where paintings held traces of substances not used for preservation or beauty, but for recognition. One panel, found in a ruined chapel in northern Italy, gave off a faint scent of rosemary and bitter orange oils known to be used in ritual protection spells. It's believed this scent was a signal, an identifier, for those familiar with certain underground brotherhoods. The painting itself showed nothing violent, but its smell, its lingering fingerprint, whispered otherwise. What we see in this era is a slow, aching realization that the world was never as it seemed, that holiness could exist beside horror, that stone was not always a foundation, it could be a veil, and that beauty, in its purest form, was not the absence of fear, but the artful inclusion of it. The emotional undercurrent of these works cannot be overstated. They are not simply historical relics. They are expressions of grief, survival, and defiance. To carve a warning into a church column, to paint a dagger into the folds of a saint's robe, these were acts of courage. These were artists refusing to let truth be erased, even as they risked their own safety to embed it in pigment and granite. When we walk through these cathedrals today, we step into that tension. We feel the cool breath of stone and hear the echo of footsteps from centuries ago. The same halls that once hosted weddings, coronations, and sermons also bore witness to plots, betrayals, and hushed goodbyes. To view medieval art without understanding the threat beneath it is to miss half the story. Because in these spaces soaring, sacred, and silent echoes remain, not just of voices, but of choices, and in the art left behind, those whispers endure. History often tells us about assassins, as if they were ghosts, faceless, voiceless, irredeemable. It catalogs their crimes, speculates on their allegiance, measures their impact on politics and dynasties. But what if we turned the mirror? What if we stopped asking who they killed and started asking who they were? What if, just once, we listened for their heartbeat instead of their footsteps? In the cobbled back streets of Bruges, under stone bridges, slick with rain, there lived a man known in whispers as Master Dagonet. His name appears nowhere in official records, yet his story survives in fragments, painted panels, signed with only a small serpent, pages torn from journals later sewn into the lining of a monk's robe, and rumors that refused to die even after centuries of silence. Dagonet was an assassin. That much is certain. He worked not for gold, but for causes he once believed in: restoring order, defending the weak, punishing betrayal. He was the kind of man who killed quickly and disappeared faster, whose loyalty was unspoken but absolute. But somewhere along the way, something inside him shifted. Maybe it was a face he couldn't forget, maybe a name he couldn't erase, or maybe he simply realized that living in the shadows was not the same as living at all. He walked away, disappeared for a time, and when he returned, it was not with a blade, but with a brush. His first known painting was small, barely larger than a book. It showed a boy reading by candlelight, the flame dancing gently, the child's face lost in thought. But behind the boy, in the folds of shadow, is the outline of a man. You can barely see him unless you look closely. He leans in but doesn't touch. He watches but remains unseen. The light bends, not from the boy's breath, but from the invisible presence behind him. It's a painting that feels like a echo of someone who was once near and didn't want to be forgotten. What followed was a quiet evolution. Dagonet painted more, always in secret, always with restraint. His work never screamed, it whispered. A sleeping woman with an open window behind her, a shepherd turning toward, a tree with a face carved in the bark, a saint whose eyes looked downward, not toward heaven, but but at the floor, where a trail of blood has been wiped clean. His symbols became his language, and through them, he gave the world something no assassin had offered before his soul. For centuries, these works were attributed to unknown artists or dismissed as decorative, but art historians today are beginning to see the thread. The serpent's signature, the themes of distance, of guilt, of protection without praise. It's becoming clear that Dagonet was not painting scenes, he was painting apologies, regrets, questions. He wasn't the only one. In monasteries, scrolls have surfaced containing what appear to be hymns, but whose acrostics reveal messages like "My hands were not clean, but my heart was full." One illuminated manuscript, believed to be part of Dagonet's circle, shows the martyrdom of a prince. But hidden in the margins is the face of the assassin, weeping. The caption beneath reads, "Forgive the hand that trembled." This is the mirror we so rarely hold up to our darkest figures. It's easy to condemn, harder to understand. Yet what Dagonet gives us is not redemption wrapped in excuses. It is the honesty of someone who cannot undo what he's done, but still longs to offer something good. Emotionally, this strikes deep, because who among us hasn't carried a burden we wished we could paint over? Who hasn't stood in front of a mirror and wondered if the reflection could ever be forgiven? Dagonet's art doesn't promise closure. It doesn't glorify his past, but it invites us to consider the cost of living in silence and the quiet power of choosing to leave the shadows behind. We often think of assassins as instruments, but perhaps some of them were mirrors, holding up the darkest parts of their world so that the rest of us could see ourselves more clearly. And in that reflection, perhaps, just perhaps, there is a path, not back, but forward. One paved not with certainty, but with courage. Not with forgetting, but with telling the truth in a new language. One brushstroke at a time. In the stillness of cloisters and the long shadows of monastic halls, where prayers whispered through cold stone and candlelight flickered against worn pages, there existed another world, one not spoken, but seen. A world of silent messages, etched into margins, gestures caught mid-motion, and meanings suspended between the lines of sacred texts. This was the hidden language of medieval artists and scribes, those who lived within the very walls built to keep secrets, who knew that sometimes the truth must be hidden not for deception, but for survival. There is a manuscript kept today in the Berlin archives, known as the Velvet Codex. Its name comes from the deep crimson velvet that wraps its cover, worn smooth by centuries of hands, some reverent, some desperate. It is officially a devotional book, psalms, prayers, parables. But to those who know where to look, it is something more. Each page is a palimpsest, a map of layered intention. Letters that seem random form, mirrored words, illumination that appears decorative becomes, with careful observation, allegory soaked in warning. In one illustration, Saint Sylvanus is shown kneeling in a garden, surrounded by olive trees. But if the page is tilted under light, faint impressions appear in the gold leaf, a shadowed figure behind a tree, a flask in his sleeve. A narrative unfolds, a plot, a betrayal, a sanctified lie. This is not just art, it is a testimony buried beneath devotion. The Codex became, to those who understood it, a record of a failed assassination plot against a bishop, disguised as spiritual parable. Symbols were layered with intention. Color, posture, and gaze were never accidental. Blue, the rarest and most expensive pigment, was used with utmost restraint, not for heavenly skies, but to cloak the hidden. A figure in blue might not be the hero, but the one carrying the unspoken burden, the one whose truth must be guarded. Posture told stories. A hand pressed to the lips may have looked like prayer, but its angle, its tension, the direction of the thumb, these were codes. One such image shows a monk kneeling before a reliquary, his finger to his mouth. Yet if one traces the lines of his cloak, it leads not to reverence, but to a tiny crossbow carved into the background, a deadly promise, masked by worship. The intimacy of these visual metaphors is profound. They speak not only to the fear of assassination, but to the desire for connection in a world that demanded silence. Artists like Matteo di Serra, and even repentant figures like Dagonet, knew the risk of revealing too much. But they also knew the pain of revealing nothing. So they left behind traces not loud, not obvious, but enough. Just enough for someone centuries later to recognize the pattern and feel the presence of a mind, a soul, across time. Even Brother Elian, the traveling scholar of sacred symbology, once wrote that certain images would only fully reveal themselves when viewed at dusk, by natural candlelight, through a polished piece of obsidian. To him, this was not superstition, it was precision. He believed the creators of such images crafted them, not for the present, but for the future, for eyes that were ready, for those who had seen enough of the world's cruelty to look deeper. And then there were the margins, the quietest places, the edges of things. These were the playground of the daring. In one French manuscript, the main illustration is of Christ feeding the hungry, but in the lower corner, just above the page's floral border, a fox in monk's robes carries a lamb away from the flock. It is so small, so delicately painted, that many archivists catalogued it as whimsy. But under magnification, the lamb's eye is open, and it is looking directly at the reader. What stirs most about these details is not their cleverness, but their hope. These were not only artists, they were survivors, witnesses, believers in the idea that truth, once hidden, might one day be seen, that even if their voices were stilled, their vision could endure. And so, when we walk through museums or flip through digitized manuscripts, we are being watched too, not with judgment, but with longing. The eyes in the artwork are asking, do you see it? Do you understand what we left for you? To the casual observer, medieval art can seem still, reverent, even cold. But to those who pause, who dare to lean in, the silence breaks. It is not emptiness, it is density. Every fold of fabric, every direction of light, every gaze cast just a few degrees off-center holds a question, a story, a plea, and the answer, always, is in how closely we're willing to look. The blades have long since rusted. The assassins who once moved silently through cathedrals and corridors are gone, their names Caldus, Dagonet reduced to legend, fragmented memory, or misunderstood whispers in dusty archives. And yet, their presence has never left us. Not entirely. It lingers not in fear, but in form, in brushstrokes, in ink, in marble, in the very way we continue to tell stories about trust, betrayal, secrecy, and power. This is the true legacy of Silent Knives, not the act of violence itself, but the echoes it left in art and culture, in the choices of painters and poets, in the symbolism that still pulses quietly through modern works. The assassin never truly vanished. They evolved, adapted, folded themselves into narrative and metaphor. They became something more elusive and more enduring, an idea. You see it in the paintings of Caravaggio, centuries after the medieval era. His use of shadow and light chiaroscuro wasn't just stylistic flair. It was a language, a whisper of danger. The tension before action. His figures seem to know something they will not say. Eyes diverted, hands clenched, bodies turned just slightly away from the viewer, as if the moment of revelation or destruction is always just one breath away. And what of literature? The 19th and 20th centuries saw the rise of characters who mirrored Dagonet's sorrow and complexity. They are not villains, they are not heroes, they are watchers, instruments of cause and conscience. From Dostoevsky's tortured antiheroes to Le Carré's morally exhausted spies, the archetype of the silent executor survives. The knife becomes a word, the ambush a decision, the death not physical but symbolic. And in those moments, we are once again asked, is it justice or is it simply shadow? In modern art galleries, some of the most powerful installations aren't the loudest. They are the ones that make you pause, that demand silence. A single object suspended in a void. A light that shifts just as you move. These are the descendants of medieval symbolism. The ivy that once crept around daggers now wraps around the subconscious, urging us to question what lies beneath beauty. A museum visitor in New York may stand before a tapestry and not realize that the cloak pattern repeating across the fabric was once a code, or that the figure in the background, barely noticed, is repeating a pose used by Matteo di Serra to signify complicity in death. Even fashion carries the weight of this legacy. Tattoos depicting cloaked figures, hooded saints, gloved hands holding roses, modern interpretations of medieval iconography, worn not as decoration, but as identity. We wear these symbols, often without knowing their roots, but somehow still feeling their gravity. The cultural memory of the assassin has not disappeared. It has simply changed clothes. What makes this legacy so compelling is not just its persistence, but its moral complexity. The assassin forces us to grapple with questions that have no easy answer. What does it mean to protect in silence? To destroy in the name of peace? To carry the burden of an act that cannot be spoken, yet shaped history? Dagonet's paintings, now increasingly re-examined by art historians, revealed that he understood this burden intimately. He didn't paint villains or martyrs. He painted liminal beings, those caught between light and dark, duty and remorse. And it is through this gray space that the legacy of the assassin finds its most human form. The myth has grown, yes. We see it in films, in series, in the silent anti-hero with the haunted past. But beneath the tropes is something realer, cultural. Inheritance built on centuries of coded art and unspoken truths. It invites us to imagine that we, too, are capable of carrying secrets with grace. That in the darkest corners of our lives, beauty can still grow. Not in spite of pain, but because of it. The legacy of Silent Knives is not about fear. It's about vigilance, reflection, and most of all, the quiet resilience of those who chose to create heaven when they could not speak. It is a legacy that doesn't ask us to condemn or forgive, only to see deeply, to question gently, and to remember that sometimes history's loudest truths are those that were never said aloud at all. There comes a moment in every story where silence turns into invitation. After all the whispers, all the glances into hidden corners, and the slow unraveling of secrets veiled in paint and stone, we arrive at the question not of what happened, but what now. That is where we are on the threshold between knowing and wondering. And that is the power of stories like these. They do not end when the tale is told. They begin when you start to see the world a little differently. The assassins we've followed called us in his shadows. Lady Isadora in her quiet strength, Dagonet in his aching redemption, Brother Elian in his endless search for meaning are not relics of the past. They are reflections of us, of the parts of ourselves we keep hidden, the fears we carry silently, the beauty we protect fiercely. They ask us not to worship their mystery, but to understand why it mattered, because the story of hidden assassins in medieval art isn't just about history, it's about vision. The willingness to look deeper, the choice to believe that beneath every surface lies more than what we're told. That art is not decoration, it is memory, resistance, healing. And when you start seeing those symbols, those cloaked figures, those sideways glances, you begin to realize something beautiful. You're part of this too, so maybe now, when you step into a museum, you won't rush past the stone saints or the faded frescoes. Maybe you'll stop, lean in, trace the curve of a hand, follow the light in a figure's eyes, ask, quietly, what aren't you saying? That act of slowing down, of noticing's how we unmask the shadows, not by tearing them apart, but by respecting their silence, and allowing their message to find its way through time, through layers of dust and doubt, into your imagination. Let this be your invitation to go looking, not just in galleries or books, but in conversations, in the everyday images around you. The way a photo is framed, the way someone tells a story and pauses before the truth. The symbols are everywhere, waiting for someone with the patience to care. You don't need to be an expert to decode history. You only need wonder. And as we close this journey, I ask you to become part of it. Share what moved you, what detail made you pause, what theory came to life in your mind. Comment, discuss. Let your voice join the centuries of those who saw, who questioned, who felt that thrilling tug of knowing there's always more. This is not the end, it's a beginning. And the next chapter isn't hidden in a chapel or scrawled in the margins of an ancient book. It's here, with you. Because stories like these only live if someone listens. And maybe, just maybe, you were always meant to. When we first entered the world of medieval Europe, we were met not with fanfare, but with quiet and unsettling, deliberate silence that echoed through the marble halls of Florence, the stained glass of Rouen, the cloisters of Toledo. It was not a silence of peace, but of breath held, of secrets waiting. And at the heart of that silence stood a shadow. It was the shadow of the assassin. We began with Lady Isadora of Florence, a noblewoman with the appearance of grace and luxury, yet burdened by a truth she could never speak. Her son, the heir to a dynasty, had a future hanging by a thread, threatened not by armies or rivals in open war but by a silent figure in the dark. Faced with impossible choices, Isadora did what many cannot comprehend. She struck first, not with her own hand, but through Caldus, a phantom whose name came with no history, no explanation, just outcomes. In choosing to protect her child, she aligned herself with death, yet she did not do it for conquest or pride, but for love. And that love, twisted into necessity, tells us more about human nature than any battlefield ever could. Caldus, the assassin she summoned, was not a monster. He was the silence between breaths, the warning in the corner of a room. A professional, yes, but also a human being whose path had led him into the folds of the night for reasons lost to time. He never sought credit. He never returned for praise. He disappeared, as all shadows do. And while his hands delivered death, he also carried something else, a strange, unwelcome intimacy. For who knows their target more closely than the one sent to end them? But not all stories in this world are shaped by blood. Some are shaped by the aftermath. From those same shadows emerged Master Dagonet, a figure once feared, then forgotten till he resurfaced in the most unexpected form, a painter. Having lived years as an assassin, Dagonet carried his grief in silence until it broke him open. He began to create, not to explain, but to process. His brushstrokes became his confessions. He painted not the act of murder, but its echoes, the moments before, the moments after, the spaces where regret lived. Through his work, we witnessed something rare, transformation. The same hand that had once ended lives now reached out to connect. And through color, shadow, and subtlety, Dagonet gave the world a truth we don't often allow our historical figures. Redemption without erasure. He did not excuse his past. He painted through it, past the blade, into the mirror. Then there was Brother Elian, the monk scholar, who wandered from chapel to chapel, cathedral to cathedral, not in search of salvation, but of meaning. He did not kill. He did not paint. He listened. He looked. He deciphered. He believed that every carving, every color, every glance embedded in medieval art held more than beauty. It held intention, warnings, longing. He saw the sacred not as a sanctuary, untouched by fear, but as a canvas on which that fear had been translated for future eyes. He trusted the artists of his time to speak across centuries, not with voices, but with symbols. And finally, there was us, the viewers, the seekers, the inheritors of these stories, not because we read them in textbooks, but because we chose to pause, to look longer, to wonder. In weaving these threads together, what have we discovered? Not just a network of hidden assassins and symbols, but something more difficult and more relevant. We've discovered that history is not written solely by the victors, but by the silent, by those who etched warnings into stone and slipped meaning between pages of illuminated manuscripts. We've learned that justice and betrayal can wear the same cloak, that redemption does not always shout, and that even in the darkest corners of the human soul, there can be a yearning to create something that lives. So what do we carry with us now? First, the lesson of complexity. None of the figures we met were purely good or evil. Isadora protected her child, but at the cost of her soul. Caldus was a killer, but also a man who left no trace, because perhaps he wished to be forgotten. Dagonet, broken by the weight of his actions, created beauty not for fame, but for peace. And Brother Elian, in his quiet pursuit of hidden meanings, reminded us that truth is never simple. It is layered, contextual, and sometimes painful to recognize. This matters now more than ever. In our world, saturated by noise, there is a temptation to see things in binaries, right and wrong, hero and villain. But the story of the assassin's shadow asks us to look again, to see the unseen, to wonder what drove someone to act before we condemn them, to consider what they carried, not just what they did. Second, we learn the value of silence not as absence, but as presence. The silence of a painting, the silence of a room full of watching eyes, the silence of not knowing someone's whole story. These silences are invitations. They teach us to become listeners again, observers, people willing to see beneath the surface and ask, gently, what is being hidden here and why? And lastly, the most personal lesson of all, the power of transformation. You may never carry a blade. You may never find yourself in a moment of impossible choice, but you will carry your own history, your own regrets, and like Dagonet, you may reach a point where what you've lived through demands to be expressed not for approval, but for release. Whether you do that through words, through art, through connection, or through healing, let this story remind you that your past is not a prison. It is part of the canvas. You have the right to reinterpret it, to create from it, to begin again. So when you walk through your life tomorrow, through your home, your city, your thoughts, remember this story. Remember that under every surface lies more than what is visible. That in every stranger is a history you cannot see. That in every silence there may be a truth waiting for your attention. Let curiosity guide you. Let empathy shape you. Let complexity comfort you. And if you ever find yourself standing before a piece of old art, stone, glass, parchment, look closer. The figure in the corner, the shadow that doesn't belong, the hand turned just slightly too far. They are not mistakes. They are messages. From Caldus, from Isadora, from Dagonet, from all those who lived in darkness but left behind light for those willing to see. And now you've seen. What you do with that vision is up to you.